Welcome back, everyone, to OpenLine. Talking politics tonight, and there's a major gubernatorial race underway in Virginia. We're following that. The Republican appears to be leading in that race. Of course, it's early. Nothing has been called in that race, and that would be a big victory for Republicans should he go on to win there in Virginia. And there's plenty of other stuff to discuss as well. Biden's agenda in Congress, other political races. And we had Reverend Fuzz call in. Always happy to hear from Reverend Fuzz. And he asked our guest, Dr. Thomas Schwartz, political science professor at Vanderbilt, what does he think the biggest problem facing our country is? And then he asked, how would you solve it? So these are tough questions. I know you're also, a historian of sorts and all that, but what are your thoughts here? The biggest problem facing our nation, how do we go about beginning to solve it?
Well, if I wish I had the certainty of some political figures being able to answer a question like this. I don't. My own thinking on this is pretty basic. I would like to see the country deal with or provide a actual secure safety net for its citizens in health and housing and other areas, so that no American no American would fall into homelessness or without health care or something like that, without at the same time ruining what is a dynamic capitalist economy. I'd like to see a balance struck that creates a safety net with a dynamic capitalist economy and an effective democracy. I do think our democracy is a precious thing in a world with a lot of authoritarian states, and I think it needs to be preserved, and I think we need to also be a symbol around the world. We have to become a more effective and humane society in order to be a model for the rest of the world. So I'd like that's both as aspects of the Democrats in terms of the social welfare degree that I'd like to see guaranteed to Americans. At the same time, I still want to see us as a dynamic, capitalist, innovative economy as we have been, and somehow striking that balance at the same time as being a world leader and a defender of democratic and liberal values.
I like that. So a safety net, but not a socialist country, a safety net, while maintaining a dynamic capitalistic economy, and so. When you see some of the bills that are being proposed and you see the fights on both sides, where do you think we are? Maybe things are working. Maybe there's one side over here, and we kind of meet more in the middle, and there's supposed to be all of this kind of fighting, and it helps narrow it down. That would be an optimistic way to look at it. Do you see that right now?
Well, I think debate and dissent and discussion is essential to a democracy, and that, the founders gave us a government that is designed, one of James Madison's great lines, in my view, is that if men were angels, we would not need a government. But basically it is to keep our passions and our bad qualities in check that government exists in part. And that government is a restraint, as well as a functioning to provide for the needs and services of the people. And that I think, in a way, we have two political parties and we have different political views, and that they do serve at times to balance each other and to prevent, you might say, from the country from going in extreme ways to one side or the other. And that's going to take, in a way that is a design of the founders to have a certain amount of balance in a country as large and diverse as this. I mean, this is an extraordinarily large country to be governed democratically. Other large countries in the world, like China and Russia, are autocracies, dictatorships. So a country of this size to be governed democratically, that's a difficult task, and that's one of the, I think, real challenges for the future.
Have we, so as you look back through history, and you're teaching Vietnam, I don't know about the Civil War, when has our democracy been most challenged in your opinion? And how do we rate right now? I mean, you've heard Biden say it was threatened, and so how much of how much of that is historically accurate in your opinion? And when has it been most threatened as you look back through history?
Well, obviously the Civil War obviously is the key one, but I would also put the Great Depression in that. I think the collapse of the economy really challenged all the values people had, their sense of whether capitalism itself should work. This was a period of time in the 30s when fascism and communism were on the rise, and our democracy, liberal democracy in general around the world, was under challenge. So I think that was probably the most serious case of the challenge to liberal democracy. We've had other challenges since, during the Cold War at times, basically trying to balance during the 60s in terms of political assassinations and turmoil then. And now I think we're in another challenge here. And in a way, the rise of Donald Trump and some of the populism he represents has been a challenge to certain democratic values. I don't see Trump as a dictator or anything like that, but I think his style and manner has certainly challenged aspects of American democracy, liberal democracy, and that's required really people to get involved and be active, and on both sides of the political spectrum.
I read tonight that it will be very interesting to see the concession speech out of Virginia. And the article was hopeful that there would be a concession speech. In other words, that somebody would admit that they lost and the process would work, and there wouldn't be this what we saw in the last presidential election. Right. What do you think about that? I mean, how important is that, and is that something you're kind of will be looking for?
Oh, that would be, yes. I think that is the fact that President Trump has not conceded the election, I think, is very much something that marks it should alarm Americans, that he cannot bring himself to concede. That is an important part of democracy, and I think I also think Stacey Abrams should have conceded the Georgia race, but I think people, when they lose elections, should concede, and I hope that whoever loses the election in Virginia will concede.
Very interesting. Another issue, and there's nothing easy here to talk about. In Virginia, a big issue has been critical race theory. How it's at this moment, again, we're 39 minutes or so after the polls have closed, 40 minutes. The Republican is doing well. Youngkin is doing very well. How important is that issue? There are those that say it's not even taught in high schools, and I think that's a fact. It's not even taught in high schools, and yet it is being used as an issue that's really maybe that's working in Virginia. And so what are your thoughts about its use and what that might mean for it being used going forward?
This is a difficult one, because I think as a historian, I certainly believe that you have to bring out both the good and the bad in the American past. And the existence of racism, slavery as a stain on American democracy, it's certainly there, and it has to be emphasized. I think that's been confused with some theoretical formulations that want to indict everything in America as racist, everything is wrong. The 1619 Project that's claimed that American Revolution was about racism, these sorts of things. And I think this is a general reaction to some of that type of thing that has been exaggerated by some of the proponents of critical race theory without it being formally designated such. I think people don't want to feel that the country is inherently evil or racist, but that's, I think, been confused with trying to tell the truth about our history. And I think that problem is there. And to a certain extent, I think the Republicans have taken advantage of some of the things, the sort of emphasis on systemic racism is sort of central to all the things that many of the Democrats have said, to confuse that with an honest reckoning with the American past. And that is, I think, a real problem, and it's a challenge to us going forward and trying to deal with these issues.
And I hate to put you on the spot, but how do you define critical race theory? Because it seems to me like, it should be perfectly fine to teach slavery was bad. I mean, who's going to say slavery was good? And slavery was a bad time in our history. I would think people would be okay with that. But what is critical race theory? And is it being used when there's a commercial that says we shouldn't have critical race theory taught to our elementary schools? Is that taking things out of context to some extent, or what can you say about that?
Yes. Critical race theory was an academic theory, primarily promoted as a way of looking at the way laws and institutions in America were so established in ways that perpetuated racial inequality and perpetuated racism. It's a theoretical look at institutions and our society that is not necessarily, it relies on a lot of assumptions that are not necessarily 100% true. It certainly identifies a lot of racial inequality, and then it claims to have the explanation in racism rather than in other factors. I don't think that's what's really being taught in these schools. I think what this is more a reaction to a lot of the racial reckoning after the George Floyd case, which did tend to sort of make the case that all of American history is about racism, and wanted to topple statues of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all these figures that because they were slaveholders, and to make the case that this is all that American history is fundamentally about racism. And I think that is what people are probably reacting to, not what is formal critical race theory.
Right. Very interesting. And there's a fascinating ballot initiative. It's on the ballot in Minneapolis, talking about basically changing the police department. And maybe we can talk about that. We'll take a break here, come back, continue our discussion right after this.